like I'm sitting in darkness.
Okay, we are live now.
Hello, everyone.
Yeah, just 1 second. Let me just get the.
No problem.
Okay, I posted it.
Fantastic.
Good evening. I'm Zani. I'm the host and the co-founder of the Forces of Renewal Southeast Asia. We are a progressive, some would even say radical, grassroots networks of a network of concerned scholars and activists from across Southeast Asia, and also with roots in Southeast Asia. Some of us are no longer living in the region, myself exiled in the UK, but we concern ourselves with the contemporary issues that pose a serious threat to social harmony, social fabric, human relations across different societies and different faith and racial communities, as well as nationalities. And so I'm extremely pleased to have this dialogue with the Swedish scholar, Arash Sedighi. It's been a very old friend of mine, and he's based in Manchester. He was born in Iran, but raised and educated up to his undergraduate degree in Sweden, and he did his PhD in politics and international studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, at the University of London. And he has been a teacher, also screenplay writer, and also a business owner, and the co-founder and host of BAME Plus podcast network. Arash will explain to us why the far right in Sweden has risen to become the second largest political party, which is actually a frightening reality, considering the resurgence of the far right political parties gaining prominence or capturing the state power, as in Giorgia Meloni and her brothers of Italy in Rome. And so, Arash, a very warm welcome to you, and please tell us what's happening in Sweden.
Well, like you said, well, thank you for having me, firstly. Like you said, the Swedish Democrats, Sverigedemokraterna, SD, was elected, has become the second largest party after the Social Democrats in Sweden. They've basically grown steadily. It's not so much as a surprise that they've grown. I mean, I think a lot of people were surprised at the extent to which they grew so quickly, but everyone can see and has seen the growth of SD since they came into parliament, got over the 4% threshold in 2010. So they got around 5-something% in 2010. And then I've got in my notes, almost 10% in 14. That was in the European elections. And then 17% in the last election, and then now 20+%, making them the second largest party. And throughout this time, what's very interesting about SD's relationship with other parties in Sweden is that they've been shunned from the beginning until now. So no one was willing to talk to them. The previous party leader of the right, the Conservative Party, Moderaterna in Sweden, was very, very firm on not cooperating with Sverigedemokraterna and obviously the rest of the parties as well. had the same position. So that's been their relationship. So SD has grown steadily, whilst all the other parties have continuously said we're not speaking to them because of the far right roots, because of the racist or xenophobic views, their position on immigration, on Islam or Muslims in particular, and anti-Semitic roots and all these things. So they've been very firmly against them throughout this time. And now they can't ignore them anymore. And now they are inviting them in to potentially make a government. And actually, they might be working on sort of them supporting a different types of government, but the doors are open now. So I don't know about the details yet. It hasn't been decided because it's right on the edge of either right-wing coalition or a left-wing coalition. But so they finally made their way in. And that's the story. The parties, since it started in 1988, it was started by the openly neo-Nazi group called the Bevara Sverige Svenskt, BSS, which means keep Sweden Swedish. Openly Nazi, neo-Nazi, essentially like a EDL version.
You mean like English Defense League?
Yeah, quite thuggish.
Yeah.
Criminally, loads of, basically the members were people who openly did seek Heil and had, committed violence in the marches. And so they were never really taken seriously in the beginning. And then later on, as they, that continued until 95. Some people say when the current party leader, Jimmie Åkesson, when he joined in 95, there was a process slowly of professionalization of the party, cleaning it of these thuggish elements. So you could see that even, I think a year after Jimmie Åkesson joined, there was an incident which was common before that of someone burning Jewish books, dressed in Nazi uniform even, I think, having swastikas on it. I think he had swastikas, and he was expelled immediately. So that was like a signal to everyone that, we're gonna take this seriously. We're getting into parliament. This is no longer a group of activists. We are politicians, and we're going to professionalize. Jimmie Åkesson, actually, the leader, he's from the south of Sweden, Skåne, and him and 3 other guys who he went to university with, they sort of are joined together, and they sort of campaigned within SD for this professionalization. They supported him to become party leader, and he, in exchange, gave him quite high up positions. Björn Söder, Mattias Karlsson, Richard Jomshof, and these are, one is press secretary, one is the editor of the Sverigedemokraterna's newsletter. So these 4 came in the 90s and professionalized it, and since then it's just grown and become more prolific, had zero tolerance against any sort of openly Nazi and openly anti-Semitic views. Although they've been very, very clear and open about their immigration stance and very open about their Islamophobia. So Jimmie Åkesson published a very famous article in 2007, I want to say. Was it 7? I think so. It was called Islam or Muslims, our greatest foreign threat. And it was in one of the biggest newspapers in Sweden, Aftonbladet. So that was a big statement, and it got a lot of people talking, and that was a sort of strong stance, and they've maintained that position against, the immigration of Muslims, arguing that there is a cultural, their argument is basically that people from Islamic countries, when they come to Sweden, there's a sort of a cultural divide that you cannot pass, that leads to crime because they can never really fit into society. So there's that whole thing. So there's a cultural basis to their xenophobia, racism, their immigration policy. So the argument is culture, not race, and they're very strict on that. Yeah.
Right. So that is what makes it different from the old-fashioned Nazism, right? That was very much based on the idea of blood and rage, right? You know, because the Kaiser Wilhelm, you know, the deposed German emperor, was writing to one of his few marshals, you know, back in 1918 or 1920, you know, that before Hitler became anybody, you know, the somebody. You know, he called the Jewish people that have been in Europe, like before Prussia was Prussia, was a mushroom, right? That grew on the German oak tree, right? Like if you got like this oak tree, beautiful, solid, you know, desirable, and then you've got this parasitical mushroom that grew on the oak tree, right? And so it wasn't about, you know, religion or culture. It was, you know, the Jewish people defined as a racial group, right? So that they, and then like Hitler further developed the idea that you know, the Jewish, the presence of Jewish people in German society really was contaminating what he considered a superior race, right? And of course, like, you know, race and culture and civilization, they're all like interconnected. But I think we are looking at where these, you know, arch racists and ideologues put their emphases on, right? Because from your explanation, as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, the Swedish far right and Swedish neo-Nazis, they shifted the focus from their anti-Semitic ideological roots, yeah, that developed in the 1930s in Sweden, right? And then transfer that racial or cultural fear and hatred onto the new group that is people of Islamic faith, right? So can you explain, you know, why in a, you know, social democratic haven, because as Sweden, you know, Scandinavian, Nordic countries are considered very tolerant, multicultural, internationalist, why are they all of a sudden, not just Sweden, if you look at Danish policies as well, why are they turning, you know, very much rightist, you know, orientation, you know, and also like explain like why you call this Swedish fascism. You know, the title you suggested was saving, you know, native white Swedes. Can you explain like, you know, what qualifies them as an ideology within the family of, you know, very toxic ideologies that we would call fascism?
Yeah, I mean, so I'll have to take a step back because you mentioned Germany in the 20s and Wilhelm, and in actually, so in Sweden, the ultra-nationalist, if you want to call them, sort of umbrella within which you have fascism, within which you have, I guess, different kinds of nationalism, which is exclusive and racist and anti-Semitic. There were two strands in Sweden. Actually, in 1918, arguably is when it started in Sweden, 1917-18. During the same time, it was growing in Germany. So you had the Finnish Civil War in 1918, or the war against the occupying red Bolshevik forces, which were coming into or already in Finland. So you had this battle in Finland between what was seen in propaganda as, in a lot of the propaganda, not all, as this red Jewish, specifically Bolshevik sort of tainted ideology that was taking over Finland, which needs to be cleansed. And you have a lot of that language of cleansing in a lot of letters. I just noted before we started, there's some books that I can maybe post on your, I can send to you for people who are interested. So during this time, a lot of Swedes, I think over 1,000 Swedes went over as volunteers in Finland to fight the Bolshevik communist Jewish invaders that they saw as Jewish. And during this time, there was a lot of the Swedish volunteers committed a lot of atrocities in Finland against people they saw as Russians, against Finnish civilians, and obviously against the Russians. And when nothing really happened in that civil war until Germany came in, and Germany was essentially invited by Finland to come in and take over because they prefer them to the Russians,
To the Soviets, yeah.
to the Soviets. And so, and when that was successful, during that brief time before World War I ended, that was very influential within Sweden. So these volunteers that went over came back, and there was an exchange of ideas, and they were given a lot of high positions. So the books that I will send have shown that there's connections between the people who volunteered in this war and then high positions at universities and the military. So that kind of anti-Semitism was very much alive in Sweden. These same people actually in 1922, after the war, started a racial institute. What was it called? There's a network of racial biology, which in 1922 started the first racial genetic institute in
Well, I mean,
Sweden.
like, you know, the University College London was one of the major centers, you know, so I mean, so were some of the institutes in France, Paris, and other places, right? I mean,
I think it was the first one. I think 1922 they started. Yeah, that was a Race Biology Institute in Stockholm, I believe. And this was started by a network of people, some of whom were part of those volunteers, and who were the result of that, called the Society for Racial Hygiene. And and Sweden was very, very open at that time to the combination of science and politics. And a lot of these were scientists that were very high up. I think the dean of Uppsala University was part of this group. He was a zoologist and believed that we need to take racial hygiene very seriously.
Well, no, I'm sorry to interrupt. I mean, there are also, like, you know, French Nobel Prize winning biologists and scientists that were involved in this. You know, I mean, like a Nobel Academy. You know, the Swedish Academy of Sciences must have been populated by, you know, pioneering fascists, you know, also doing scientific work, but interpreting them in a extremely, you know, racially damaging ways. They set the trend for the, you know, European, you know, scientific racism, in quotes.
So exactly, and that exists, right? In Sweden, that's quite, well, relatively successful lobbying by that side. But at the same time, like you said, actually, sorry, one more thing about anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism goes back a long way in Sweden as well. Even to the 14th century, there weren't even any Jewish people in Sweden at the time, but there were these stories of anti-Semitism, a lot of it from theological positions, like the Jews killed Christ and they don't eat pork and they're weird. So there was a lot of that stuff. But even now you see in I think Uppsala, Domkyrkan, in quite a lot of churches from the 14th century, you see images of mocking Jews, which is not just meant as an anti-Semitic thing, but it was also to keep there's this mysterious Jew away. It's like a lucky charm to make sure they don't infiltrate. So that existed far before, but at that time it was very religiously based, and I think it became, like you said, you know, in the 19th century, more about the cleansing of the blood when genetics starts coming into it, because people obviously then thought, wait, if a Jewish person converts, are they now one of us? And they thought that can't be true. Then I guess then that started. But then, like you said, there was a parallel fascist and very racist ideology. Much of it started by Per Engdahl, or he was the pioneer.
How do you say his name? Per
Engdahl,
Engdahl,
E-N-G,
right.
Engdahl.
So you were referring to this, you know, fascist ideologue that was born in, I think, like a 1909 in Malmö, and then he went on
Definitely.
to become the leading fascist. And then, he was also an iconic leader for the founder of IKEA. I was reading up on that. I mean, I'm sure a lot of our listeners are the lovers of IKEA products, but here was the lifelong, essentially a lifelong fascist, right? IKEA founder, who never repudiated his view that the most infamous, the Swedish fascist leader was a great man. It's like a German kid who grew up in the 1920s, admiring Hitler and never renounced or revised his view that Hitler was a great man. Yeah? So
Now they have furniture called Muhammad or Ahmed, I think.
are you
Muslim
serious?
name. I don't know if it's Muhammad, but there's some Muslim names in there. I saw some in Manchester. I don't know if it's a regular thing. So he's probably rolling in his grave. But with Per Engdahl, actually from early in his life, he was very much part of an intellectual fascism. So these two strands, there is the sort of thuggish, there's a scientific, which became the thuggish. You can very much draw that line. And there is this sort of Per Engdahl intellectual, cultural position within fascism. And he was never really a massive fan of Hitler. So he had huge difference, especially so he was always against, or very early on, against the racial genetic side. His position was that's not really what's important. It is the cultural
racism.
Yeah,
basically cultural purity / superiority, right? And if you believe that your culture and civilization was the best and the most civilized and the superior type, then of course you wouldn't want it to be contaminated by other cultures, right? Like I mean, it's a fundamentally an anti-intellectual and anti-empirical position, because by definition, cultures and civilizations were not pure at all. And so carry on. So what you're saying is that Swedish brand of intellectualized fascism.
This was before Mussolini and before Hitler. Yeah, before Mussolini, before Hitler. He was very
influential across Europe, as I understand it, right?
Yeah, very much influential across Europe. Later on, actually, I think Per Engdahl became the sort of center. I mean, Sweden's legal position on Nazism and fascism is very liberal compared to other European countries. In Sweden, freedom of speech is very important politically. So that's part of it. But also Per Engdahl was in Malmo. So a lot of in the 50s and 60s and later on, he died in 95 or in the 90s. His home, or Malmo, became in southern Sweden, again, southern Sweden is where Jimmy Åkesson's from, became a sort of central hub of a Europeanized version of fascism. Because before that, like we said, it's about the nation. So keeping and his first thing was, he called a new svenskhet, like this new Swedishness. It was very big. But then that Swedish focus on Sweden as one group to keep pure changed and became a Europe. And that sort of focus on Europe, and his whole goal became in the 50s, 60s to unite European fascists that were left after the war, that were still around, more than me, and discussed a lot in this channel, the sort of remnants of Nazism that stayed around. And his idea was, we gather these not around racial biology and genes, but around a European culture and keeping Europe clean against these cultural globalist. Now it's very popular to say globalist, and there's different types of anti-Semitic tropes that exist. Yeah,
I think like a lot of people who consider themselves social justice oriented, or the left, they're always talking about the Socialist International, this and that. But what is shocking is instead of like different social justice network helping each other and gelling into a international solidarity movement, right, for a more just and humane world, what we are seeing is that so-called far right. I mean, I actually don't use the word far right because I consider far right a journalistic euphemism for what essentially is different the variants of old world fascism. Like there are elements, okay, of course, like then specificities and context differ, right? Like the Italy, France, Brexit, Britain, Trump, USA, right? Bolsonaro's Brazil. I mean, you've got Orban's Hungary, and then like Poland, right? But there are certain features and elements that are common across these differently named political parties. And one is the othering, right? And humans are never seen as there's no sense of the universal the fellowship of brotherhood or sisterhood. It's always like this national, us versus them, right? But I think I was reading a Swedish or the researcher's article before I came on Zoom. She was saying that this false idea that because the two most influential and deadly fascist regimes, Mussolini's and Hitler in Europe, were defeated, that people stop taking fascism and fascist ideas seriously. Yeah, so that's why we were all taken by surprise when Le Pen the captured, like, I don't know, 80 seats in the National Assembly, and her party is actually waiting in the wing because Macron cannot run another term, right? So I mean, give Marie Le Pen 4 years and she will be crown president, right? And then Brexit also has a very strong the racist pillar to it, because there are economic and institutional arguments. But as you well know, Brexit campaign was run on this anti immigration, anti-refugees, the anti non-whites, or even whites from Eastern Europe, and so the fact that this fringe group, the Swedish Democrats, that were not taken seriously only a few years ago, all of a sudden find themselves within reach of state power. You see what I mean? Second largest. And what was it that they were doing or saying that propelled them to the second place in the social democratic Sweden? I mean, highly educated, the high, living standard society, very few. I mean, there's no conflict, no war. Over the last 400 years since Sweden tried to attack Russia and failed. Yeah, and so it's a peaceful country with the shine of Nobel prizes. Even this week. And now we are looking at the dark clouds of what you call, and which I agree, Swedish white fascism hanging over Sweden. How come? I mean, what was the Social Democrats doing
I mean, I
that
think
was appealing to the majority Swedish?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. I mean, social democrats have grown. It's important to say that social democrats are now, comfortably comfortably the largest party.
But Swedish Democrats.
Sorry, so yes, the Swedish Democrats. I mean, that's a very good question, and I guess there's obviously many reasons, and it's multi-layered. but very significant in Sweden, the concept of folkhem, the concept of that, which means the people's home, that the nation is the people's home. This was actually started, this was, I don't know if it's coined, but it's sort of famously assigned to a right-wing thinker, I think Schellén, who was a conservative thinker in the 20s. But it was made famous by Per Albin Hansson, who is one of the biggest Swedish social democrats, our sort of Roosevelt in Sweden. And so he made this very, so in Sweden, historically, throughout this time, the concept that the nation is the people's home has always, as successfully been very inclusive nationalism. In Sweden, there's a very friendly nationalism, or that's how it's been for a long time. So obviously within...
I mean, you lived there as a child and
yeah.
you grew up there, right?
Yeah.
So like when you were growing up, what was it like, within that fulcrum?
Yeah, well, I grew up in a quite, one of the, so this brings me to the other bit. So I grew up in a lot of immigrants. So these immigrants or refugees and immigrants from particularly outside of Europe that arrive in Sweden obviously end up in urban centers. Everyone does. There's a lot of the urbanization in Sweden is a problem, as it is in other places, because there's a struggle for jobs and it expands, and then the inequality becomes more obvious and leads to many things. But immigrants sort of tend to be bunched up into specific areas. I went to school in one of these areas in Kroksbäck in Malmö, where it was a significantly majority non-white or non-ethnically Swedish. So me growing up, it was a very different experience than a lot of Swedes. These areas have now grown. They have become more visible. I think the visibility of people from Islamic backgrounds it's obvious. And you said, how has SD got to this point? I think one massive reason is that the left or the non-fascist parties have given up this concept of folkhem. They didn't really claim it, because it's sort of been given that Swedish nationalism is friendly thing and we're all included, and they've never really they've let that go. So when people are experiencing what they experience is crime, gun crime going up, bombs, I think it was like record number of bombs in this past decade. More important than all of this is the heightened importance of social media, which puts people into bubbles, and you get this algorithmic feeding of your own prejudices. You get, once you start with a couple of searches, then they just feed you more of the same and in the most extreme possible way. So this has created a almost very easy position for Sverigedemokrater to say, we believe in the people's home, we believe in Sweden. Everyone else says the same thing, which they do. The topics of immigration, linked to crime, these things that people experience, a lot of Swedes experience, have not been discussed by the mainstream parties and have been avoided by the mainstream parties. So all they needed to do was say, they all sound the same, which is a fact. They don't like us because we say the truth. That's half true, because they don't talk to them. So they seem more authentic. And I think Pew did the research. I had the statistics here. I will just find it. It was something like, what was it? I'll find the details later, but a huge number of people who voted for SD. Oh yeah, 60% of people who voted SD had unfavorable opinions of Muslims in the country. They shouldn't be in our country. And then people who did not vote for SD, the numbers fell to like 15%. So there's a huge, very clear distinction there. So Islamophobia and the fear of refugees and Muslim, particularly men, a lot of similar tropes that you see in England and in Europe, the idea that Muslim men bring with them sexual crime. These kinds of tropes are, very, very popular. There's a lot of tropes you see with that are similar to anti-Semitism 70, 80 years ago. Muslim women are called female Muslims. You have these words, especially online, making them subhuman. And the concept of the female Jew was giving birth and spreading the concept that they have by sort of two alliances, two, dual alliances, not really loyal to the nation, but secretly got their own loyalty. All these things are reasons, I think.
Yeah. So what you're saying is that the Swedish Democrats, this Swedish fascist party, the second largest, after this the recent election, are simply articulating what obviously a significant segment of white Swedish, society are quietly feeling or thinking, right? And so, this is a rather interesting.
It was, sorry to interrupt, it was very quiet. And you've seen now slow sort of coming out of Swedish Democrats. People are slowly now admitting that they are Swedish Democrats. It was a very sort of taboo thing, and they've broken through that taboo.
Yeah. I mean, like Donald Trump, who called, in his campaign speeches, when he was running against Hillary Clinton, and successfully in 2015 and 16, he was calling Spanish-speaking, the migrants, workers, asylum seekers from Central and Latin America, particularly Mexicans, right? Rapists and criminals, right? I mean, he was just like calling them all kinds of names, right? And then this, racial stereotyping, right? Of vulnerable populations, right? I mean, like, okay, the Muslim populations would have the mosques as their places of worship, their customs, what they eat, their dress code, right? Their communal relations with and family relations, all of them became subjects of scorn, right? Because you're different. It's not simply that, okay, Muslims or the Jewish people are different. You are different and you are inferior, you are unacceptable, you are substandard, according to our white Swedish Christian, middle class norms, right? So difference became signs of inferiority, unacceptability, right? And correct me if I'm wrong. And so where is all of this taking the Swedish society and politics to?
I mean, now,
Yeah. I mean, what do you see as the future of multiculturalist, inclusive, democratic society and the political system?
I think there's many. I mean, for one, so like you said, one of the things that makes SD an ultranationalist or fascist, at least rooted party, is that they can fluctuate, which is why I agree with you. Far right is a ridiculous concept because they are not really right wing on the economic sort of political scale. They're very Eurosceptic. They believe in sort of national protectionism to a certain extent. Their position on welfare is not the same as neoliberals. I mean, neoliberals would be on the far right. And so
economic, in terms of the economic and financial policies, right?
Yeah, so they can fluctuate, they can pick and choose. So what they've done is successfully, because there's that massive gap left in this concept of I think the people's home, Folkhem, they've managed to just be the only ones, or project themselves as the only ones that don't care about the consequences. They will say the truth. And within another huge thing is this online anti-woke feelings of all the same debates that are happening with trans rights and pronouns and all this stuff that, you know, people are talking about on social media, SD is the only one that occupies that conservative space, anti all this whining and complaining and, you know, all this stuff. So this globalist agenda and all this stuff about the vaccines and Bill Gates and all that stuff is very sort of, they've captured all of that within them. So they very successfully have done that. So what to answer how it would be in the future is difficult because they can always change. And also it depends very much on what other parties do. So what you've seen in Sweden is, like in the rest of Europe, a continuous breakdown of social welfare programs, privatization, breakup of rural areas, urbanization. You know, since the if you look at Malmo, where I grew up, and where Jimmy Åkesson.
Yeah, I've been there. It's really a old industrial dustbin.
Exactly, and that in the 70s and 60s, it was one of the biggest. You know, it had the biggest mall. The big crane Kockums, which is not there anymore, was the biggest one in Europe or something. It was huge. It was a social democratic haven, and it was a success story. So, you know, there is all the same story all over Europe and I guess the world, particularly Western world, of slow shift from social democratic Keynesian economics to neoliberal whatever. We all know that story. So you've seen that story, and all the Swedish people are seeing that story. They're also seeing only one party asking in some way to return to the past. There's only one, and there's only a Swedish Democrat. So they're the only ones who say it was better before. Everyone agrees. What did we have then? We had these smaller communities. Our children used to play. There was no gun crime. There was no, you know, these things that weren't there before. We want to go back to it's the 50s. It's Per Engdahl's 50s. So how it will, if no one else occupies that space, if no one else offers this view, this populist, if there is no other populist alternative, they will grow even more. I think the left party, Vänsterpartiet, tried to move away from sort of liberal campaigning and become sort of more of a populist party this time around, but they lost some votes. So it's unclear how it will work, and the most likely thing is that they will simply just grow. And
right.
Yeah.
I mean, you're a student of politics yourself, and you know, ideas don't parachute themselves from the sky, right? They are rooted in different economic and cultural conditions, right? Social conditions. And so the one thing that you notice in countries or social context or economic context where, you know, so-called far right, I mean, we are calling a spade, you know, fascist ideologies have to be labeled fascism, you know, not simply far right. Far right is like, you know, way too
it's false.
acceptable.
Yeah.
You know, it is a complete falsity, right? You know, like if you get to the, you know, far end of conservatism, you know, you get to fascism, right? You want to return to the idealized, romanticized past where there were no others, no contaminants, if you will. Only us, white Swedes or white English or white Burmese, or you know, Buddhist Burmese. So you
like
know,
in Burma did. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I was
So
going to say
like,
you have that masculine side as well. So Swedish Democrats they're very popular amongst men, older men and younger men outside the city in particular. But also their politics is very masculine. The politics
the same with the BJP, you know, Modi government, you know, because weakness is unacceptable, you know. And the RSS, you know, I mean, like shifting the conversation slightly, you know, basically the Hindutva the right wing, or not right wing. Basically, Hindutva is the India's version of fascism, right? And Modi himself was, has been a lifelong member of this group called RSS, and he stays single, and the supposedly practices celibacy, devoted to the party, but act very macho and masculine. This hyper masculinity, right? So that was the strength, and then the same with Nazi ideology. Like if you look at the Nazi films, the propaganda film, German women had the particular places assigned to them by the party and the ideology, right? And the brown shirts were this masculine group, militant, violent, very centrally organized, and so you have that within this not social Swedish Democratic Party, the promotion of tough, macho, masculine element in their thinking.
You have it in certain extent. I wouldn't go as far as the Hindutva in Sweden, because they have been very successful and effective on cleansing the logo of the party was, I think, a burning Swedish flag. It was like this crazy one, and then they changed it to a blåsippa, like a little harmless blue flower.
They make themselves quite wholesome, right?
Very, very wholesome, and they have foreigners and people from Muslim. There's Iranians and Kurds, and there are people in there. So it's not, they've cleansed that part of it. They're there's a clear line between the Per Engdahl cultural racism or cultural fascism within the Sverigedemokraterna. So the masculinity is in particular reference to what we see today in the social media sphere, all the gender pronouns and feminism, the way feminism is seen. So the research on people who voted for Sverigedemokraterna and the views on women is what we think it would be. So there is that as well. It's a reaction against what's seen as an outside control. And I think, like in many places, people feel like everything is changing. There's all this removal of all the welfare that used to be here. We used to be able to go to the doctor. Now it's like an online thing, and if you click it, you got a queue for 7 weeks. And if there's all these things, meanwhile, there's 100,000 immigrants coming, and they're getting these rooms. And so the only people who say that this is unacceptable is SD in that very clear way. And when everyone else sounds the same, you are proving half of what they say is correct. We are the only one who don't. In his speech, Jimmy Åkesson says it all the time, that we're the only ones that dare speak up. In that sense, it's masculine. We're not afraid. We're going to say it. We're going to say how it is. You guys can walk around, eat your meatballs, and be nice as much as you like.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is like the masculine, this tough, fierce fighter image, and that could be projected through man or woman. If you look at like a Maloney, right, and the brothers of Italy, right, and they were opposition, and they were against everything that other economic neoliberal crowd, other parties were, standing for. And the same in UK as well. We had like the prime minister over the span of 4 or 5 years, like 2 women, Theresa May and Liz Truss, and they are all like really nasty. Here Theresa May brought in this hostile environment, this anti-immigration racist policies, right? That was taken to another level by Priti Patel, and then now Suela Braverman, and then Liz Truss the same thing. You know, what I'm interested in is how do they relate Sweden to European Union, and that has been one of the major the factors in terms of the new fascist parties either in power or becoming very influential, in France or in the case of Meloni in Italy. How do Swedish Democrats view Sweden's relations with Brussels?
Very negatively. I mean, it follows that same line that used to
national identity, national take back control kind of.
But not national. I think that the difference between in UK, I would say a stark difference between UK and Sweden is that in Britain, these discussions of immigrants are coming and crime and they're taking our jobs, and that whole discussion has always been in the political spectrum ever since I came here in 2002. So since then I've seen it. It's not a secret thing. I was very surprised actually when I came and these things were very openly discussed on BBC, because in Sweden it hasn't, and it's been very taboo. And in fact, the government fighting against the growth of the establishment in Sweden fighting against Sverigedemokraterna's rhetoric have done so by quoting statistics. They've released press releases saying, actually, no, the crime has not gone up. No, actually, rape has gone up. But that's because in Sweden, I think the only country in Sweden, if a woman, a wife of a man, claims that he raped her 5 times in that month, that's recorded as 5 separate cases. Whilst in other countries, that man's a rapist once. Like, that's one case. And that happened. That's why we see this peak. Different things like this, where they're trying to statistically and factually prove them wrong. When all
but that's that's shocking. The mass issue. The mass issue is the perception, the stereotypical perceptions, right? Mixing crimes with racial or ethnic or religious or migrant identities, right? And the mainstream parties, especially Social Democrats, they are avoiding to have a proper conversation nationally. Whereas, in fact, what you're saying is that Swedish Democrats capitalize on that vacuum, where society really wanted to discuss these things out in the open, and they offer that seemingly direct and honest conversation. And then take the votes.
Precisely, and it's half truths. So half of it is always true. So everyone who's lived in Sweden can see that the multiculturalism, the immigration policies have not been successful. So you have these areas with low income, low level of English, loads of things that are not good, low employment or high unemployment. So in these areas, there's gangs, there's violence. And again, so the Swedish establishment's argument against it is actually, that's not because they're Muslim or foreign or whatever, that's because of the location and the context. And so there's that doesn't matter to someone who lives outside of Sweden. So you're just covering your tracks, they think. So there isn't an open discussion about why, what this is. And to be honest, the left can easily say, well, the reason all these things are wrong is because of the privatization and the destruction of the welfare system.
But that's too complex and academic for average Joe on the street, right? I mean, you've got a similar conversation, very unpleasant and scary, in Germany after the former Chancellor Angela Merkel opened the doors for like Syrian refugees and others, right? I mean,
thing in Sweden, same thing, same time as well.
Yeah, like there were like the popular discourses at the time in Germany saying that multiculturalism wasn't working, but Merkel wasn't like simply saintly. The Germany always need the labor force, right? And that was one of the factors. Of course, like her humanistic or humanitarian empathies were admirable, but policies were never made with a single factor in mind. Like the economic labor needs of German economy was addressed through the mass migration, right?
Yeah,
And
precisely. So, I mean, yeah,
yeah, carry on.
I was just going to say, so you can see this. It's very important historically to see this growth in Sweden, and like many countries, because who weren't in World War II, Sweden was neutral, but even Finland to a certain extent, it sort of fizzled out. So the all these, I mean, to go from the leading country in racial hygiene theory, one of the leading countries in cultural fascism, that stuff is not going to just go away. That's in the culture. But this is why the social democratic project in Sweden was very successful, which is the thing that everyone talks about when they say Sweden's a haven for welfare and best place to live. That's the build-up of Per Albin Hansson. Olof Palme, who was assassin,
Right,
the hatred towards him was again similar to now from these same people that make up Sverigedemokraterna today. This idea that there is a outside control, there's a globalist agenda, there is people pulling the threads of our leaders. And again, this, you asked about their position against Europe. Their relationship with Brussels is those guys are these fat cats taking our money, which is again true. So they use these half truths, and no one else says these words. No one else says, why should we pay some people in Brussels? The democracy is here, which is again half true. And then they, that globalist thing, and then they link that to, I don't know, George Soros or Jews or whatever. And these things happen outside the main party, but it's the same thing. Everyone knows what we're talking about. So that's happening. But at the same time, they're very openly pro-Europe, as in European culture. Again, this goes back to Per Engdahl in the 50s and 60s, and the Malmörelsen, which was a Skånerörelsen. There is the Malmörelsen, which linked or tried to unite the fascist forces within Europe after the war under this sort of intellectual, more friendly, parliamentarily active groups, and pull them away from thuggery and beating people up and saying stupid things and sorting it out, getting hierarchies in place. So it's very, very obvious and clear link between these people.
Yeah. Finally, I think, can you shed some light on the history of Sweden as a as a state with Nazi Germany? You mentioned the Sweden was neutral. My own understanding through my conversations with some of the more honest older generation Swedish friends is that under this neutrality pact cover with Nazi Germany, the Swedish industries were profiting massively, by supplying, the Saab engines to Hitler's the Air Force. These like German fighter bombers, they were fitted with Swedish engines, right? While the Hitler's Air Force was bombing across Nazi-occupied Europe and also places like England or UK. They were using the Swedish technology, right? The Saab engines, right? And then also the massive raw material supplies coming from Sweden, right? Going into the German or Nazi armament. And then you've got the issue of the Nazi troops being allowed through to essentially capture or invade Norway and turn Quisling into a full collaborator. They were recruiting massive number of Norwegians to go and fight Stalin's Soviet Russia, right? So can you say, can you tell us about how the Swedish education system and the general knowledge of Swedish public about their country's, historical interactions with Nazi Germany? Because this is one area that continues to fascinate me, because not many countries have really processed their own historical complicity with Nazi crimes, 70 years ago, and they like to feel proud. They make their citizens proud by telling them that we are neutral. Well, I mean, in the case of the Nazi occupation, you can't really be neutral. Even if you were neutral, that was still a complicity.
Yeah, I mean, so the first part of your question, the Swedish participation in the Second World War. I mean, so in Sweden, there is a very strong, very powerful feeling of, we're the empathetic country. So there is there's a huge force, massive
empathetic towards whom?
Towards everyone from abroad. So they very openly and happily take in asylum seekers. This is a huge force in Sweden. So it's not by no means like a very sort of right wing, again, there you go, ultra-nationalist exclusive country. They've always been open. But in the Second World War, again, remember that strand of 1918 in Finland and the growth of the racial hygiene theory. The right party, the sort of normal mainstream right-wing party, had within it openly racist people. And in 1934, SNF, which is Swedish Svenska Nationalförbundet, which is an openly Nazi or more or less Nazi group, was kicked out of the right-wing party. It was a youth group. But that same group was invited back in with the next leader. So it wasn't like a complete.
So what was that youth group the group that IKEA founder belonged to? He was a card-carrying member, right?
I think it's SNF.
Yeah.
I will have to say, yeah. So they were in and out of the mainstream right-wing party. So during World War II, I think it was, Göran Persson, that was later. Gösta Bagge, who was the party leader of the right, he invited them back in after they were kicked out before. And there was a very famous meeting again in 1939 called Bollhusmötet, which was a student debate on whether we should let in Jewish refugees. And this was debated by people of the SNF in Uppsala, and the people against bringing in more Jewish people won the debate. It was a very popular sentiment that we shouldn't. And Sweden rejected many Jewish people, which after tracking them afterwards, it turned out that they then died and perished. Then obviously, like I said, there was a more friendly line. Folke Bernadotte, the very famous Swedish aristocrat, went to Holocaust camps, negotiated with the Nazis to get certain Jews on his white buses back to Sweden. So there are people that did the other side. So Swedish participation in World War II is very complex and nuanced. And had Germany won the war, the Swedish elite politically already had a lot of Nazis in place. It was ready to go, and they would have been foreign ministers and whatever. The fact that Germany lost changed all that. About education of this in Sweden, actually in 1997, when I was still in Sweden, the leader of the Social Democrats, Göran Persson, sent out a booklet to every single Swedish home about the Holocaust. And I think that's continued. I'm not sure. I left Sweden in 2002, but that was a huge thing at the time. So in that booklet, the role of Sweden has been discussed. All of these things that I mentioned were there. So the idea of the Bollhusmötet, the role of SNF, the Per Engdahl's rhetoric, a lot of these were there, but by no means is this popularly discussed. And I don't think people are aware of the prominent role of ultranationalism and fascism within Sweden.
So you know, so Sweden remains among the countries in Europe where these ultra-nationalist fascist ideas were never processed openly in school or in popular you know, discourses or in government policies, right? Because you know, it's quite shocking that it's only Germany, particularly West Germany, was compelled to undergo this denazification, whereas in fact you know, more than half of the main European countries, southern, western, you know, eastern European countries that never processed their fascist, you know, variously fascist ideas and ideologies. You see what I mean? I mean, Spain, you know, if we take the view that, you know, European colonialism that introduced this racial and civilizational hierarchy in global cultures around the world where they occupy, which was like pretty much every other non-European continent, right? Africa, Asia, all the Americas, right? These were countries, continents that were, you know, plundered and conquered by sword, and on one hand, and Bible on the other hand, right? And these countries adopted the similarly rigid scientific racialist views, right? And so they continue to reel from the legacies of this scientific racism, right? And I mean, like my country, Burma, same, Sri Lanka, India, right? So what do you see as in 5 years' time? Do you see Swedish Democrats coming to power?
I would say so, yes. I think, especially if they don't get into government now, then I would say pretty much 100% yes. If they do get into government, you know, you have, once you're in government, you get blamed for stuff. So then they can no longer be the activist who tell the truth because they have that control. But I think, so it depends on if they get into government, and I also think it depends on where the conversation goes. In a way, it's a good thing, I think, in Sweden, because this has always been there. This was
so now it's out in the open. So
out in the open,
the
people can
majority
come out.
public who say they're against fascism, they have to confront this you know, monster that's growing within their society.
And yeah, more importantly, the Social Democrats and the left, and but also the right, the mainstream around Moderaterna and Folkpartiet and the Christian Democrats, they will have to within themselves discuss what do we think about, you know, Muslims and immigration, and is it linked to crime, and they have to deal with these things, which they, you know, a lot of people who would never vote for Swedish Democrats still won't be able to. You know, I've listened to a lot of debates after the election, and not debates, people discussing what's happened, and the arguments even still against it is, yeah, but they're Nazi and they are racist. So even now there is a fear of actually describing why, you know, they are wrong, or why it's just name calling. And I think the longer that continues, where they just dismiss SD because they are just Nazi, which they're not, and to be honest, they're more close to Per Engdahl, like we said, than the racial biology people. He was a massive fan of Mussolini, not a fan of Hitler. The longer we just dismiss them, and all they can need to do is say, well, look around you, there's crime and there's poverty and there's, you know, it's not what it used to be, is it? And everyone would agree with that. So as long as they're just dismissed, I think, and these things are not discussed, then yeah, they will grow. And I think, yeah, if they don't get into government, then 100% they will grow.
Yeah, because, you know, like from the outset, you mentioned that you know, while anti-Semitism is still there, but it's no longer the the ideological bread and butter for the the European fascists, in the 21st century, because now the Muslims and no other non-Christians have become the new Jews of the Europe. Because I don't know if you recall, when Aung San Suu Kyi last visited Europe, she visited Budapest and issued a joint declaration with Viktor Orban, saying that Muslim immigration is a problem, and that was Aung San Suu Kyi, Nobel Peace Prize winner, signing off on this categorically racist Islamophobic statement with Viktor Orban. And so well, we need to watch very closely the what happens in Sweden, because it seems one by one a lot of European the liberal democracies are being captured or becoming very close to being captured by these Islamophobic and new fascist parties, be they France or Italy or Hungary or Poland or now Sweden. And so Arash, thank you so much for taking the time to share your thoughts, and I learned quite a lot. You've been listening to Dr. Arash Sedighi, the Sweden raised a political scholar, now based in Manchester, UK, and he also runs BAME Plus podcast network. And my wife is a fan of Arash's feminist podcast, and so I have to listen to that one, to those
Mansplaining
ones.
Feminism, yeah, check that out as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, mansplaining feminism. How about that? Yeah. Yeah, have a good night. You must have a dinner now, like after a long day, and I have to eat as well. So
Enjoy your
so it's, yeah. Have a good night.
Thank you very much.